A werewolf shifter romance written by Katherine Stewart. Prologue. The wind, oh, it was a cruel thing that night, whipping with a life of its own, and if you listened close, really close, you could hear the tiny, broken sounds of a child beneath its howl, desperate little whimpers, each one a tiny blade twisting in the dark. You could almost feel the air crackle with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Then, a sharp, ugly tearing of fabric, followed by a soft gasp, so full of terror it stole the breath from the night itself. And then came the click of cold metal, stark and final. A child's cry, choked off before it could truly begin, was swallowed by a sudden, sizzling hiss, a sound like magic itself being snuffed out, sharp and painfully brief. What followed was a silence that pressed in, heavy and absolute, the kind of quiet that screams louder than any sound, broken only by that desolate wind moaning its sorrow. And into that void, a voice dropped, each word like a shard of ice, deep, unnervingly calm, seeming to echo from a place devoid of all warmth. What is aberrant must be bound. What is dark must be silenced. Forever.
The weight of the crown felt heavier tonight, each jewel a stone pulling him down into an abyss of duty and an echoing solitude that clawed at his insides like a starving beast. Valerius Vane, Alpha King of the Western Mountains, stalker of shadows both within and without, stared out from the high battlements of his moving war camp, the wind whipping his dark hair across a face that rarely knew the grace of a smile. Down below, the fires of his vast army glittered like fallen stars, a testament to his power. Yet up here, the only company he kept was the gnawing emptiness that had been his closest confidant for too many desolate years. And then, it happened, a searing pain behind his eyes, not physical, but of the soul, a sudden, violent wrench as if a distant part of his very spirit had been brutally snared. He gasped, his hand flying to his temple, the world around him momentarily dissolving into a vortex of icy dread and a single, piercing feminine scream that wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a shard of agony embedded deep within his own being. What in the blighted hells was that? His own shadow, the infamous king's shadow he wrestled daily, coiled tight within him, not in aggression, but in a strange, almost painful sympathy. It was a sensation so alien, so deeply unsettling, that for a moment, the formidable Alpha King felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear. This wasn't the blight, nor the whispers of rebellion from the petty northern lords. This was something else, something intimately tied to a fate he hadn't yet met, but could already feel closing in like a silken, shadowy net. Valerius strode through the command tent, the thick furs crunching softly under his heavy boots, his mood darker than the starless sky above. The lingering echo of that spiritual agony still hummed beneath his skin, making him restless, his temper a raw, exposed nerve. General Tarvin, a man whose face was a roadmap of past battles and unwavering loyalty, stood ramrod straight by the campaign table. The reports from Lord Voros's territory are disquieting, my king, Tarvin began, his voice a low rumble, carefully chosen words trying to cushion a blow he knew was coming. Valerius's hand, already clenched, tightened further. Disquieting, Tarvin? Or are they the usual litany of incompetence and cruelty I've come to expect from that blighted corner of my realm? His voice was deceptively soft, a predator's calm before the strike. He'd inherited a kingdom stitched together with ancient alliances and simmering resentments, and lords like Voros, with their petty tyrannies, were a constant drain on his patience, a constant insult to the justice he tried to uphold. Because of men like Voros, the common folk suffered, and suffering, Valerius knew, bred dissent like maggots on a corpse. Tarvin nodded grimly. There are whispers, sire, of Omegas treated no better than livestock, of a particular iron-fisted overseer who finds pleasure in the snap of a lash. The usual fare, perhaps, but the whispers are louder this season. Valerius felt a familiar surge of cold fury, the king's shadow stirring within him like a caged storm. He fought it back, his jaw tight. And what is an alpha king to do, Tarvin, when his own vassals act like feral curs, preying on the weakest among them? Do I ride down there and flay the hide from this Voros myself? His words were laced with a dangerous edge. It wasn't just about justice. It was about the kind of world he was desperately trying to build, a world where power didn't automatically equate to brutality. Maybe it was fate that he was heading there now, not just for alliances, but for a reckoning. Your arrival is already announced, sire, Tarvin reminded him. Your presence alone often encourages better behavior. For a time, Valerius scoffed, turning to a map where Voros's lands were a dark stain. But the rot remains, doesn't it? It seeps into the foundations. He thought again of that sharp, distant agony, that silent scream that had pierced his soul. Could such cruelty reach so far, wound so deeply, even a stranger? He didn't know what scared him more, the possibility that it could, or the sudden, inexplicable certainty that it was somehow connected to him. I want our best scouts to observe Voros's fortress discreetly before we arrive. I want to know what shadows lurk in his halls beyond the ones he casts himself. He needed to understand the source of this disquiet, this resonance of pain. What would you have done if you felt such a thing, a distant echo of suffering that felt like your own? Moments later, as Tarvin left to issue the orders, Valerius found himself staring at his own reflection in a polished shield, seeing not just a king, but a man haunted by a power he barely controlled and a loneliness that was a constant ache. The crown was a gilded cage, and he, its most powerful prisoner. The journey towards Voros's domain was marked by the usual tedious displays of fealty from minor lords whose territories they skirted. Valerius endured them, his face a mask of stone, his mind elsewhere. His reputation, he knew, often did half his work for him. The Vane Fury, the king's shadow, these were names whispered in fear, and sometimes, he had to admit, he leaned into that fear. It kept the wolves within his own borders from snapping too hard at his heels. That night, as he sat by a crackling fire with his inner circle, the conversation, as it often did when they were far from the formalities of court, turned more candid. Kale, his youngest commander, brash and fiercely loyal, spoke up. They say your very gaze can freeze a man's blood, my king. That Lord Voros will likely soil himself before you even speak. Valerius allowed a rare, grim smile to touch his lips. A useful reputation, Kale, though hardly one that warms a man's bed at night. Wouldn't you agree? The words were out before he could stop them, a sliver of the profound loneliness he usually kept so carefully guarded. Because truth be told, that was the core of it, wasn't it? The power, the crown, the fear he inspired. It all built walls, thicker and higher than any fortress. His oldest advisor, Lyra's namesake, but a man of stern wisdom, Elms, cleared his throat. A king's path is often a solitary one, sire. But your lineage has always carried unique burdens and unique strengths. Elms was one of the few who knew, or at least suspected, the true nature of the king's shadow, the Vane family's dangerous, often uncontrollable, magical inheritance. Burdens indeed, Valerius murmured, staring into the flames. This blight that creeps upon our borders, Elms, it feels different, older, more malevolent than any mere pestilence. He'd sent his best mages, his wisest healers, and they'd all returned with faces grim, their own powers proving almost useless against it. It was as if the land itself was dying from a sickness of the soul. Deep down, he knew the truth. Whatever this blight was, it resonated with the same chilling emptiness he sometimes felt within his own shadow power, a terrifying kinship. Perhaps your visit to Voros will yield more than just a reluctant alliance, sire, Elms said quietly. Sometimes, answers are found in the most unexpected of shadows. Valerius looked at him sharply. Elms's eyes held a knowing depth that always unsettled him. You speak in riddles, old friend. Do I, my king? Or do I merely observe that even the strongest alpha needs a balancing force, a calm to his storm? The legends of your house are specific on such matters. Elms's gaze was pointed. He was talking about a mate, Valerius knew. A fated queen. A concept that felt as distant and mythical as the dragons his ancestors were said to have ridden. What kind of woman could possibly stand beside him, withstand the maelstrom of his power, the darkness that was so intrinsically part of him? He didn't know what he truly wanted more, a partner to share the burden, or to simply be left alone in his gilded, powerful misery. But the thought, once planted, refused to leave. A balancing force. The words echoed the strange peace he'd felt when that distant agony had momentarily stilled his inner storm. Days later, as they neared Voros's lands, the oppressive atmosphere Valerius had sensed seemed to intensify. The very air felt thick, charged with an unseen dread that had nothing to do with the petty cruelties of its lord. Valerius found himself poring over the ancient, locked diary of his ancestor, Queen Elara the Shadow-Wise, a book he usually kept hidden even from himself. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded, filled with cryptic verses about the Vane lineage's unique connection to shadow magic, its burdens, its terrible potential if untempered, and the absolute necessity of a resonant heart to bring it into balance. The Lion of Vane. One passage read, its script elegant yet forceful, shall find his roar only when the shadowed dove takes flight beside him. Apart, they are but halves of a storm. Together, a force to reshape the world, for good or ill. He'd read it 100 times, and 100 times it had felt like a beautiful, impossible fairy tale. Yet now, with the memory of that distant, piercing agony and the subsequent, shocking moment of inner stillness, the words felt different. Pregnant with a terrifying possibility. Sire, Kale's voice cut through his thoughts. The scouts have returned from Voros's fortress. Their report is unsettling. Valerius closed the diary, the weight of generations settling upon him. Unsettling in what way, Kale? More than the usual tales of abused servants and fattened coffers. Kale hesitated, his usual bravado tempered with a rare seriousness. They spoke of a particular silence around the Omega quarters, sire. A fear so thick you could cut it. And one of them, a young woman, always with her head down, always in the shadows. They said there was something different about her. An aura of deeper despair. And a collar, sire. Not a simple Omega's band, but something etched with runes our mages couldn't identify from a distance, runes that seemed to absorb the light. A collar that absorbed light. Valerius felt a cold dread snake down his spine. This went beyond Voros's usual brutality. This hinted at something darker, something more insidious. Something, perhaps, that even the Order of the Silent Fang, those zealots who hunted rogue magic, might be involved in. Not only that, but the description of the runes, it was chillingly similar to some of the darker binding diagrams in Queen Lyra's diary. Because of that, a new kind of anger, cold and sharp, began to burn within him. This wasn't just about a cruel lord anymore. This Omega, Valerius said, his voice dangerously quiet. What else did they observe? Nothing specific, sire. She made herself invisible. But one of the scouts, an older shifter with keen senses, said he felt a flicker, like a dying ember of immense, suppressed power. And a sorrow so profound it made his own wolf ache. A dying ember. Suppressed power. Sorrow. The words resonated with the strange sensations he himself had experienced. Before he could move, before he could even process the implications, the image of wide, terrified eyes, swimming in unshed tears, the vision from the night the agony had first struck him, flashed behind his own. He didn't know what scared him more. The thought that this unknown Omega was the source of that connection, or the sudden, fierce, protective surge that roared through him. The night before their formal arrival at Lord Voros's fortress was heavy with an unspoken tension. Valerius stood alone on a rise overlooking the valley, the fortress a dark blot against the horizon. He was preparing not just for political maneuvering, but for a confrontation. The information about the collared Omega had settled in his gut like a stone. What if this was the source of the spiritual wound he'd felt? What if her suffering was somehow a beacon, a call his own shadow-laden soul had unknowingly answered? It sounded like madness, yet a large, black raven, ancient and unervingly intelligent in its gaze, landed on a barren branch nearby, fixing him with a stare that felt centuries old. It wasn't one of his own messaging birds. This creature felt different, older, wiser. It tilted its head, then let out a single, soft caw before taking flight, not towards his camp, but directly towards Voros's fortress, a silent arrow loosed into the coming dawn. Valerius watched it go, a strange sense of inevitability settling over him. Maybe it was fate, this collision course he was on. He thought of Queen Lyra's words, "The lion of Vane shall find his roar only when the shadowed dove takes flight beside him." He was the lion, undoubtedly, but a shadowed dove? An Omega girl, collared and broken, radiating suppressed power and sorrow. It seemed impossible. And yet, "My king," Elms approached, his steps soft on the damp earth. "You are troubled." "The world is troubled, Elms," Valerius replied, his gaze still fixed on the distant fortress. "And I am its king. How could I be otherwise?" He finally turned, his eyes blazing with a new, unshakable resolve. "Tomorrow, we enter Voros's den, and I will have answers. About this Omega, about her collar, and about the shadows that seem to connect us all." Because deep down, he knew the truth, a truth that was both terrifying and exhilarating. His solitude was about to end, shattered by a force as potent and as misunderstood as his own. The silence within him, the echoing emptiness, was about to meet its match. And just like that, everything was about to change. The wind shifted, carrying the distant scent of fear, yes, but also something else, something wild and sweet and utterly, dangerously compelling.
The biting wind that heralded the king's procession felt like a personal affront to Elara, each gust tugging at her threadbare servant's dress as if to expose the trembling heart beneath. It wasn't just wind, though. It was an energy, a palpable wave of raw, dominant power that pressed in on the fortress, making the ancient stones hum and the very air crackle with an unbearable tension. And then, from the depths of her soul, a place she thought long dead, a silent scream clawed its way up her throat, a desperate terror so profound it threatened to shatter the fragile peace she guarded. Because in that suffocating wave of alpha might, something within her, something bound by the cold iron of her collar, recognized a distant, terrifying echo of its own chained music. It was the most terrifying sensation, this feeling of being seen by a power she had only ever prayed to avoid. The grand hall of Lord Voros's fortress was a sea of nervous energy. Elara, small in her drab gray, pressed herself against the cold stone wall, a mouse praying the hawk wouldn't notice. Her gaze was fixed on the flagstones, because to look up was to invite a pain she knew all too well. Each beat of her heart was a frantic drum. "He's here," a whisper rippled through the servant ranks. "The Alpha King has entered the gates." Elara squeezed her eyes shut. "Be invisible. Be nothing." But then, the great oaken doors groaned open, and a heavy silence fell. Into that silence strode not just a king, but a force of nature. Alpha King Valerius Vane. He was a tempest, tall, cloaked in dark furs, his presence sucking the air from her lungs. His dark hair fell around a face carved from granite and shadow, beautiful in a way that was terrifying. And his eyes, they swept the hall, twin shards of glacial ice. Elara felt that strange, painful pull from her collar again, stronger now, a thrum that vibrated deep in her bones, drawing her awareness towards him. Her suppressed shadows writhed, terrified and inexplicably, called. This is it, then, she thought, breath-catching, to be marked for destruction. She wanted to run, but her feet were frozen. A noblewoman near her tittered, magnificent, isn't he? But so, forbidding. Forbidding. An understatement. He was an avalanche. And Elara, the smallest flower in its path. Moments later, a clumsy page stumbled, his tray clattering. Wine, red as blood, spread. Every head, including the king's, turned. For one agonizing second, Elara felt that icy gaze sweep her section of the wall, and her world stopped. The page was swiftly removed, but that brief, horrifying flash of the king's attention had done something. Elara's fear spiked, and a tiny, imperceptible flicker of her shadow magic, a spark from her tormented soul, escaped the collar's grip. An accident, born of pure terror. But he felt it. Valerius, moving towards Lord Voros, stopped. Dead still. His head turned, slowly, back towards her. Elara's breath hitched. No, no, no. He couldn't have, how? Her magic was bound. Yet, his eyes, those chips of ice, found hers across the hall. And they held. The world narrowed to that single, impossible connection. The nobles, the guards, the torchlight, all faded. Only the king, his gaze an almost physical touch, stripping away her invisibility, seeing past the drab attire, right into her terrified, shadowed core. What did he see? He inhaled, a sharp, audible intake of breath that seemed to draw something essential from her, leaving her hollowed. And in his eyes, Elara saw shock. Recognition. And then, something else, something that made her blood freeze and her collar pulse with agonizing heat, a dawning, predatory interest. It was as if a wolf had scented its long-lost prey. How could he look at me, her mind screamed, as if he knew my soul's deepest secret. And then, he began to walk. Not towards Lord Voros. But towards her. Each step King Valerius took was a hammer blow against Elara's composure. The courtiers parted before him, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning scandal. Elara wanted to scream, to run, but she was trapped, pinned by his inexorable approach, his gaze never leaving hers. The air grew thick, the silence profound. He stopped less than an arm's length away. Close enough for her to see the faint silver threads in his dark hair, the lines of weariness around those terrifyingly intense eyes. Close enough for his scent to swamp her senses, pine, cold mountain air, alpha power, and something else, dark, wild, and unsettlingly familiar, like a storm her own shadows recognized. My king, Lord Voros finally stammered, hurrying forward, the dais is this way. Valerius raised a hand, a casual gesture that cut Voros off. His eyes remained locked on Elara. She trembled, head bowed. A calloused finger, surprisingly gentle, was beneath her chin, tilting her face upwards. She had to meet his gaze. The ice was still there, but now it burned with a blue fire, an intensity that seemed to see into her very marrow. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it resonated through the hall, through her. Deep, resonant, and implacable. This one, he declared, his gaze holding hers captive. Her shadows call to mine, and mine answer. A collective gasp swept the hall. Elara's mind went blank. Her shadows? His answer? She is under my protection. His thumb brushed her chin, a possessive touch that sent terror and a confusing flicker of warmth through her. And she is mine. Mine. The word landed with the force of a blow. It shattered the silence. It shattered hierarchy. It shattered Elara's world. Her collar pulsed, once, twice, a searing heat, as if in protest or horrified recognition. The grand hall erupted. Not in cheers, but in shocked whispers, horrified gasps, outraged murmurs. Nobles clutched pearls. Lord Voros looked gray. Servants exchanged terrified glances. Elara felt like she was drowning. But Valerius was a rock, his form shielding her. His hand was on her arm, firm, possessive. He turned, his gaze sweeping the assembly, his silent fury quelling the loudest whispers, though the undercurrent of scandal remained, thick and poisonous. "My personal guard," Valerius's voice cut through. "Attend to, my Omega. See, she is taken to my chambers. Now." He didn't know her name. She was, in that moment, his Omega. Two immense alphas flanked Elara, their proximity suffocating. As they guided her away, her feet wooden, her gaze, dazed, caught on a figure half hidden in the throng. A man, cloaked, yet his eyes were cold, flat, filled with hateful recognition as they met hers. The insignia of the Order of the Silent Fang on his collar made her blood run cold. He knew. The Order knew. Her claim by the king had also, it seemed, signed her death warrant. Looking back, Elara might reflect, I should have known a king's claim wasn't a shield, but a spotlight for every monster. The journey to the king's temporary quarters was a blur. When the guards left her in a lavish tent, filled with furs and the king's scent, she stumbled to a silver mirror. Her reflection was a ghost, pale, wide-eyed, the hated collar a dark brand. Still a captive. Only her captor had changed. The tent flap rustled. Valerius filled the entrance, his presence sucking all air, his expression unreadable, those glacier blue eyes fixed on her. Elara wrapped her arms around herself, a fragile defense. "What?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling, the question a desperate plea torn from her soul, "What have you done to me?" His silence was her only answer, promising nothing but more uncertainty, more fear, and perhaps, a fate far more terrifying than any she could have ever imagined. The air between them thrummed, thick with unspoken words, unseen powers, and the undeniable, terrifying scent of destiny.
Her whispered question, "What have you done to me?" hung in the opulent air of his campaign tent, a silken thread of pure terror that wrapped around Valerius's very core, tightening with every beat of his own suddenly unsteady heart. He'd faced down armies, stared into the maw of dark enchantments, and wrestled the volatile shadow that was his own damn birthright. Yet the sight of this slip of a woman, this Omega with eyes like a haunted forest and a collar that screamed of ancient, forbidden magic, made something within him ache with a terrifying newness. What had he done? He'd claimed her. He'd followed an instinct so profound, so deeply resonant with the very fabric of his being, that to deny it would have been like denying the rise of the sun. And yet, looking at her now, small and trembling, a cornered fawn before the wolf, a wave of something akin to regret? No, not regret, but a stark, uncomfortable understanding of the sheer, brutal force of his own actions slammed into him. This wasn't a political alliance. This wasn't a strategic acquisition. This was a soul he had just tethered to his own stormy, uncertain fate. And she was, quite clearly, petrified. Valerius let the silence stretch for a moment longer, his gaze unwavering from Elara. He watched as she hugged herself tighter, a fragile barrier against the king who had just upended her entire existence with a few possessive words. He saw the faint, angry red mark where the collar bit into her delicate skin, the almost invisible tremor in her hands. And truth be told, a fierce, protective surge, so potent it nearly buckled his knees, warred with the frustration coiling in his gut. Frustration because she was terrified of him. Frustration because that damn collar felt like a living, malevolent thing, obscuring her true scent, masking whatever power she clearly possessed. "I have," he finally said, his voice deliberately softer than the roar that had claimed her in the hall, though it still seemed to fill the confines of the tent. "Brought you under my protection, Omega." A simple statement of fact, yet it felt wholly inadequate. You were not safe where you were. She flinched at the word Omega, as if it were another lash. Her eyes, wide and dark, finally lifted to meet his, and what he saw there, a raw, bottomless well of fear, yes, but also a flicker of something else, something resilient, something, knowing, made his own shadows stir in recognition. Protection? Her voice was barely a breath, fragile as spun glass. Or a new cage, my king? The title was a shard of ice, a bitter acknowledgement of his power over her. He couldn't deny the truth in her words, could he? What did his grand pavilion look like to her, if not a more gilded prison? Perhaps both, for now, Valerius admitted, the honesty costing him more than he'd anticipated. He took a step closer, then another, stopping when her breath hitched, and she shrank back further. He wanted to understand her, this strange, fated creature whose mere presence had caused such an uproar within him and without. "That collar you wear," he began, his voice carefully neutral, though a possessive anger at the thing itself simmered beneath the surface. "It is no ordinary Omega's band. The runes, they are ancient, dark." He had an insatiable need to know more, to understand the silent scream he'd felt from her very soul. Elara's hand flew instinctively to her throat, her fingers brushing the cold, hateful metal. It keeps me safe," she whispered, the lie so transparent it was almost painful to hear. Safe from what? Or safe for whom? Valerius took another slow step. He had to see it, touch it, understand its vile purpose. "May I?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, indicating the collar. He saw the conflict warring in her eyes, the terror battling a desperate, flickering hope for what? Rescue? Understanding? When she gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, her body rigid with apprehension, he reached out. As his fingers, calloused from years of wielding both sword and scepter, brushed against the cold, rune-etched metal, Elara recoiled as if burned. And in that same instant, a tiny, uncontrolled spark of pure, unadulterated shadow energy, black as a starless void, crackled from the collar, stinging his fingertips with an icy fire, making the very air in the tent drop by several degrees. He jerked his hand back, not from pain, but from sheer, unadulterated shock. What in all the blighted hells was that? He stared at his tingling fingers, then back at Elara, whose eyes were now wide with a fresh wave of terror, her hand clamped over her mouth as if to stifle a scream. What sort of Omega collar, he mused, his mind racing, the pieces of a terrifying puzzle beginning to click into place. Rebuffs an alpha king with shadow magic? Before she could answer, if she even could, she finally broke, the words tumbling out in a torrent of desperate pleading. "Please," she begged, tears now streaming freely down her pale cheeks. "Just let me go. You don't understand what you've done. He will find me. They will all find me now." Her raw terror, her talk of he and they, sent a shiver of genuine unease down Valerius's spine, a feeling he wasn't accustomed to. Before he could press her further, before he could demand to know who they were, Kale, his youngest and most impetuous commander, burst into the tent, his face grim, foregoing all protocol. "My king," he panted, his eyes wide with urgency. "General Tarvin requires your presence immediately. We've found something. Or rather, someone." Valerius's gaze flickered to Elara, her plea hanging unanswered in the air, then back to Kale. "What is it, Kale? Speak plainly." Kale swallowed hard. "One of the shadow-cloaked envoys from the hall, sire." He tried to slip past the perimeter. When challenged, he bore the mark of the Order of the Silent Fang. and he carried a coded missive, clearly meant for eyes beyond our borders, speaking of an aberration claimed and the resonance feared. The order. Here. Already. And resonance. The word echoed the assassin's dying gasp from Valerius's own recent past, a past Elara couldn't possibly know about. Unless a cold certainty settled in Valerius's gut. This was no mere coincidence. Elara, her collar, her suppressed magic, it was all tied together, a knot of secrets and danger that had just landed squarely in the heart of his camp. And it seemed the Order knew far more about her, and perhaps even about him, than he was comfortable with. He gave Elara one last, hard look, her tear-streaked face a maelstrom of fear and despair. "We are not finished, Omega," he stated, his voice flat, before turning to Kale. "Take me to Tarvin." What he didn't say, what he couldn't yet voice even to himself, was the dawning, terrifying realization that his claim, his instinctive, soul-deep act, might have just painted a target not only on her back, but on his own, and perhaps on his entire kingdom. The stakes, he was beginning to understand, were far higher, far more personal, than he could have ever imagined. The captured Order agent was a zealot, his eyes burning with a cold, unwavering fanaticism even as he knelt bound in Valerius's command tent. General Tarvin stood beside him, his expression grim. "He will say nothing of his masters, sire," Tarvin reported, his voice low. "Only that the shadow must be purged and the cycle broken." Valerius studied the man, seeing not a common spy, but a soldier in a hidden, ancient war. The coded missive, partially deciphered by his mages, spoke of Elara not by name, but as the vessel of the unmaking, and hinted at a king of shadows, whose awakening must be prevented at all costs. King of Shadows. The term resonated uncomfortably with his own Vane Fury, the dark power he fought to control. This order, Valerius mused aloud, more to himself than to his general. They hunt rogue magic users, do they not? What makes this Omega so special, Tarvin, that they would risk infiltrating my very camp, risk my direct ire, merely hours after I've claimed her? He paced the tent, the furs rustling, his mind a whirlwind. He felt Elms's earlier words about his lineage, about a balancing force, pressing in on him. What if, he thought, a wild, almost heretical idea taking root? The shadows they fear are not just hers, but mine as well. What if this resonance they speak of involves us both? He dismissed Tarvin and the prisoner, needing solitude to grapple with the implications. His gaze fell upon the ancient, locked diary of Queen Lyra the Shadow-Wise, the one he'd briefly consulted before. Now, it felt less like a collection of cryptic verses and more like an urgent, desperate message from the past. With a newfound determination, he forced the ancient lock. The pages, brittle with age, whispered open, revealing elegant script, detailing not just the Vane lineage's shadow gift, but also the devastating consequences when it was left untempered, unbalanced. And then he saw it, a detailed drawing of a collar, its runes almost identical to the ones he'd seen on Elara's, described as a device to bind the shadowed dove, lest her song awaken the lion's full, devastating roar prematurely. The shadow dove, Elara, and he, the lion. The diary spoke of a fated, resonant Omega counterpart, essential for any shadow-gifted Vane king to achieve true balance and control over their immense, volatile power. Without her, the king's shadow would eventually consume him, or an external force could exploit it. By all the gods, Valerius breathed, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Her collar wasn't just to suppress her magic, it was to prevent their resonance. And the Order, they weren't just hunting her. They were trying to control a power, a destiny, far greater than he had ever conceived. He thought of Elara, trembling in his tent, begging to be let go, speaking of they who would find her. She knew. She knew what she was, what they were, what the collar truly meant. And she was terrified, not just for herself, but perhaps for him too. Looking back, he would later admit, the truth was there all along, hidden in riddles and runes, waiting for a desperate king to finally seek it. How could I have been so blind for so long? A sudden commotion outside his tent shattered his thoughts. Shouts, the clash of steel, a familiar, terrifying surge of dark energy that was not his own. He was on his feet in an instant, his own king's shadow rising to meet the threat, his hand already on the hilt of his sword. He burst from his tent into the chaotic night. An assassin, cloaked in shadows so deep they seemed to drink the moonlight, was cutting a swath through his personal guard, heading directly for Elara's tent. Valerius roared, a sound that was pure alpha, pure king, and pure, unadulterated fury. He charged, intercepting the assassin just as the figure reached Elara's tent flap. She screamed from within, a sound that lanced through him. As he engaged the assassin, a deadly blur of shadow and steel, he saw Elara at the tent's entrance, her eyes wide with terror. The assassin, skilled and unervingly silent, pressed him hard, clearly aiming for a killing blow. Then, just as the assassin lunged with a poisoned dagger aimed at a gap in Valerius's defense, a violent pulse of raw, uncontrolled shadow energy erupted from Elara, from her collar, lashing out like a terrified, cornered animal. It wasn't aimed, it wasn't controlled, but it struck the assassin's arm, making them cry out and stumble, the dagger skittering away. That split-second opening was all Valerius needed. He drove his sword home. As the assassin crumpled, their dying gaze fixed on Elara, they gasped, a chilling, sibilant whisper. The resonance, it awakens. Valerius stood panting, his own shadows swirling around him, turning to face Elara. She was staring at her own hands, then at him, her face a mask of terror and utter confusion at the power that had just inexplicably burst from her. The assassin's dying words hung in the air between them, a terrifying confirmation of everything he had just read. "What?" he demanded, his voice rough, a mixture of awe, dawning understanding, and a new, profound fear for what this all meant for both of them. "What are you, Elara?"
His question, "What are you, Elara?" slammed into her with the force of a physical blow, each word a hammer against the fragile shield of denial she clung to for so long. The chaos of the assassin's attack, the terrifying, uncontrolled surge of her own forbidden magic, the dead man's chilling last words about resonance, it all swirled around her, a vortex of terror threatening to pull her under. And now, the king, this terrifying alpha king who had claimed her, whose eyes seemed to pierce right through her skin to the writhing shadows beneath, was demanding an answer she barely understood herself, an answer that could very well be her death sentence. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, her hands trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists to still their flight. What could she possibly say? How could she explain the curse, the collar, the constant, gnawing fear that had been her only companion for as long as she could remember? The truth felt like a shard of glass lodged in her throat, impossible to swallow, even more dangerous to speak. Valerius stood before her, a towering silhouette against the flickering torchlight of the now heavily guarded encampment, his own shadows clinging to him like a familiar cloak, his gaze relentless. The scent of his power, mingled with the metallic tang of freshly spilled blood and the ozone crackle of her own errant magic, was overwhelming, suffocating. He was waiting, his patience a tangible thing, stretched taut like a bowstring. Elara swallowed, a dry, painful rasp. I don't know," she finally whispered, the words a fragile offering in the charged silence. It was the truth, in a way. She knew parts, horrifying fragments, but the entirety of it? The why of it? That remained a terrifying enigma. "Don't lie to me, Omega," his voice was low, a dangerous rumble that vibrated through the ground, through her very bones. He took a step closer, and she flinched, her gaze dropping to the blood-stained earth at his feet. "I saw what happened. That power." The assassin spoke of resonance. "What is it? What are you hiding?" He wasn't just angry, there was something else in his tone, a raw, almost desperate need for understanding that was, in its own way, even more terrifying than his wrath. Because it hinted at a connection, a shared destiny she wasn't ready, wasn't able, to face. There are stories, she began, her voice barely audible, forcing the words past the lump of fear in her throat. Of omegas, whose magic was a curse. She instinctively touched the cold, hateful metal of her collar, the brand of her shame. They were hunted. Silenced. For the good of all, they said. Her eyes, wide and haunted, finally lifted to meet his, a silent plea for him to understand, to perhaps even show a sliver of mercy. That is all I am, my king. A curse. An aberration. It was what the order had beaten into her, what the collar screamed at her with every painful pulse. Valerius watched her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, he spoke of his own burden, of the king's shadow, a dark, volatile power within him that he fought daily to control, a power that had isolated him, made him feared. As he described it, Elara felt that familiar, terrifying hum again, that disturbing echo of her own magic, but this time, it was in his words, in the raw honesty of his struggle. Her eyes widened, not just in fear, but in a dawning, horrified recognition. That sound you made, he pressed gently, his gaze sharp, when I spoke of my shadow. What did you recognize, Elara? Before she could answer, before the terrifying truth could fully form on her lips, a wave of dizziness, a backlash from her earlier magical exertion and the collar's cruel grip, washed over her, and the world tilted, a merciful darkness claiming her before she had to give voice to the impossible. When Elara next awoke, it was to the cold light of dawn filtering into the tent and the even colder hostility of the king's court. The whispers followed her like carrion birds whenever she was escorted from Valerius's pavilion, hushed, venomous words about dark sorcery, about an omega enchantress who had ensnared their mighty king, dragging him towards a blighted doom. The Order of the Silent Fang, it seemed, had wasted no time in planting their poisonous seeds. She saw it in the narrowed eyes of the nobles, the fearful reverence that had once been solely for Valerius now tainted with suspicion when directed at him, and outright disdain when it fell upon her. She was a pariah, a contamination. How quickly they turn, she thought with a bitterness that surprised her, from fearing a king's power to fearing the one who might share it, or worse, taint it. The isolation, once a self-imposed shield, now felt like a suffocating shroud woven by unseen hands. Even the servants who brought her meager meals averted their gaze, their hands trembling as they placed the tray down, as if her very presence might infect them. One afternoon, the weight of it all, the fear, the isolation, the constant thrumming pain from her collar, became too much. A memory, sharp and brutal, of her branding by the order, the searing pain, the cold laughter, the vows of silence forced upon her, overwhelmed Elara, and she crumpled to the floor of the opulent tent, consumed by a storm of silent sobs, her body shaking uncontrollably. It was Valerius who found her there, a small, broken heap amidst the rich furs. She expected anger, or perhaps cold dismissal. Instead, he knelt beside her, his large presence surprisingly still. He didn't touch her, not at first. He simply waited, his silence a heavy cloak around them. Then, haltingly, he began to speak, not of her, but of himself. He told her of the first time his king's shadow had truly manifested, as a boy, the terror he'd felt, the fear in his own parents' eyes, the whispers that had followed him ever since, branding him as something other, something dangerous. His voice was low, devoid of its usual commanding timbre, filled instead with a raw vulnerability that stunned Elara into silence. In that moment, looking at this mighty Alpha King, a man who could command legions with a word, she saw not just a terrifying captor, but a fellow soul struggling with a dark, inherent power, a reflection, however grand, of her own cursed existence. For the first time, her inner voice whispered, a fragile tendril of understanding unfurling in the desolate landscape of her heart, I didn't just see the wolf, I saw the man beneath the pelt, a man as haunted by his shadows as I was by mine. He didn't offer platitudes, didn't demand answers. He just shared his burden. And when he finally, hesitantly, reached out and placed a large, warm hand on her trembling shoulder, a gesture of unexpected, unasked for comfort, Elara didn't flinch away completely. She trembled, yes, but a tiny, almost imperceptible part of her leaned into the touch, a silent acknowledgement of a shared, shadowed path. It was the first truly human connection she had felt in a lifetime, and it was as terrifying as it was achingly precious. The fragile truce, however, was short-lived. Urgent reports soon arrived, painting a grim picture. The shadow blight, the creeping darkness that had been slowly consuming the kingdom's borderlands, was accelerating its spread, moving with an unnatural speed and an almost sentient malevolence. It was no longer a distant threat, it was an immediate crisis, now encroaching upon a vital, populous territory. Scouts returned with wild, terrified eyes, describing how the very land itself seemed to cry out in agony, how shadows twisted into unnatural, predatory shapes, and how the blight seemed to react, almost intelligently, to concentrations of ordinary magic, nullifying it, feeding on it. Valerius was forced to act, his face a grim mask of royal responsibility. He would ride out himself, he declared, to face this encroaching doom. Elara listened, a cold dread coiling in her stomach, a dread that intensified 1,000-fold when one of the scouts, his voice shaking, described a recurring symbol found at the very heart of each newly blighted area, an ancient, wicked-looking sigil. As he described it, tracing it in the air with a trembling finger, Elara felt the blood drain from her face. It was the same primary rune that was carved into her collar, the one that pulsed with a cold, malevolent energy against her skin. The connection, horrifying and undeniable, slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Her magic, her curse, her collar, it was somehow linked to this creeping death that threatened to swallow the entire kingdom. What would you have done, you might ask, faced with such a horrifying revelation? What choice was there, really? As Valerius prepared his retinue for the dangerous journey, as he issued orders with a grim finality, Elara found her voice, a small, trembling thing, yet filled with the desperate, newfound resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She stepped before him, before his surprised commanders. "My king," she said, her voice shaking but unexpectedly firm, her gaze meeting his. "I believe my curse, the magic bound by this collar, it might be connected to this blight." Her hand went to her throat, to the cold metal that was both her prison and, perhaps now, a terrible key. I must come with you." Valerius stared at her, his expression unreadable, his glacial eyes searching hers. Shock rippled through his assembled alphas. An Omega? On such a perilous quest? But Elara stood her ground, her fear a cold knot in her belly, yet dwarfed by a terrifying, burgeoning sense of responsibility, of a destiny she could no longer run from, a destiny now irrevocably tied to the King of Shadows himself.
Her words, "I must come with you," struck Valerius with the force of a storm, each syllable a testament to a courage he hadn't fathomed from the Omega who had trembled before him. He stared at her, this slip of a woman, her eyes holding haunted shadows yet now blazing with a desperate resolve. Take her into the heart of the shadow blight, a place reeking of unnatural death, madness, utter madness. And yet, her belief that her curse was tied to this doom resonated with a chilling echo of his own suspicions, the whispers from his ancestor's diary about a shadowed dove, whose fate was intertwined with his lineage. Could this truly be it? This fragile, collared Omega, the key? His alpha instincts screamed to protect her, to lock her away. But the king within him, burdened with a shadowy legacy and a desperate need for answers, knew this was a path they might have to walk together. "You understand what you are asking, Elara?" Valerius finally managed, his voice rougher than he intended. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. "I understand that this blight, It feels connected to what is wrong with me, my king. If there is a chance my presence could help." She trailed off, her voice a whisper, yet laced with an iron will. He could feel his commander's silent judgment. Taking her was a risk beyond measure. But not taking her, that felt like ignoring fate itself. "Very well," he heard himself say, the decision tearing from him. "You will ride with us. But you will stay by my side, Elara, at all times." "Understood." Her answering nod was almost imperceptible, but the relief in her haunted eyes was a tangible thing. And in that moment, Valerius knew their fates, already bound by his claim, were about to become inextricably, dangerously intertwined. What choice did he have, when her essence seemed to hum in terrifying harmony with the abyss he was sworn to conquer? The journey into the Blighted Lands was a descent into a silent, monochrome hell. Valerius kept Elara close, her gentle mare padding softly beside his war charger. The air grew colder, heavier, the vibrant greens giving way to a landscape leached of color, trees like skeletal sentinels. An unnatural silence permeated the twisted woods, broken only by the mournful wind. Elara bore it with a stoic courage that surprised him. She was pale, her eyes wide, but she didn't complain, even when the oppressive atmosphere made seasoned warriors uneasy. He found himself watching her more often than he should, noting her hand instinctively going to her collar when the blight's influence felt strong, the shiver that would run through her. And with every glance, a strange, unwelcome protectiveness, fierce and possessive, coiled tighter in his chest. That night, as they made camp, blighted wolves attacked, their forms twisted, eyes glowing with malevolent green. Valerius was in the thick of it, his king's shadow rising. He saw Elara, cornered, a wolf lunging. Before he could reach her, she acted. A scream, yes, but then a wave of pure shadow, blacker than night, erupted from her, not wild, but shaped. It didn't incinerate the wolf. It pushed it back, a tangible force that seemed to momentarily cleanse the blight from its essence, leaving the beast whimpering before it fled. His men stared. Valerius felt his own breath catch. "What was that?" Kale whispered beside him. Valerius didn't answer, his gaze fixed on Elara, who swayed, ashen. "That," he said, his voice a low growl, as he strode towards her, "was survival." Just as he reached her, she collapsed. He caught her, her form shockingly light, her skin cold, the collar radiating an unbearable chill. His heart gave a painful, unfamiliar lurch. They pressed on, the blight's influence growing, and with it, Valerius's unease. Elara remained weak, but refused the litter. Her courage pricked at him. He shared his water skin, offered her rations, small gestures that felt strangely significant. His scouts brought disturbing news. The blight wasn't just spreading, it seemed to be coalescing, drawing towards ancient ruins in the Greyfong Pass, a place rumored to be a nexus of shadow magic. More unsettling, his tracker, Finn, reported signs of another party moving through the Blighted Lands, their tracks obscured, always paralleling their own, as if they were being herded. "The order," Valerius growled to Elms that evening. "They are guiding us." Elms nodded, his ancient eyes troubled. "We're luring us, my king. Those ruins, the place where shadow magic is greatly amplified. A place where a resonance might either be perfected or catastrophically broken." Valerius felt a cold dread. He remembered the assassin's words. He thought of Elder Maeve at court, her advice subtly steering him. Could she be? The unease lingered. "Prepare for a trap," Valerius commanded Tarvin. He looked towards Elara, huddled by the fire, her collar pulsing with a faint, sick luminescence, causing her visible pain. The closer they got, the more agitated she became. What was this creature, and why did his soul feel so bound to her torment? The ruins loomed from the blighted mist like skeletal remains, radiating despair and corrupted power. The air was thick, cloying. Elara's collar now visibly glowed an angry red, humming with a vibration that made Valerius's teeth ache. She clutched at it, her breath shallow. "My king," she choked. "This place, it calls to the shadow in me. It wants to devour it." Valerius dismounted, moving to her side. "Stay close, Elara," he commanded. As they stepped into the crumbling main courtyard, Elara cried out, stumbling. He caught her. His eyes fell upon a partially preserved mural. Two figures, Alpha and Omega, wreathed in swirling dark flames and softer shadows, hands clasped, their combined magic pushing back a tide of darkness. Before he could process it, Elara gasped again, a tearing sound. Her collar cracked, a piece clattering to the stone. A surge of her true shadow magic erupted, potent, vast, and with desperate intelligence, it arced through the air, directly towards him. Simultaneously, Valerius felt his king's shadow roar to life, not in fury, but in an overwhelming, welcoming response. The air crackled, a storm of black and silver energies intertwining. Visions flooded their minds, their ancestors, the Vane's shadow gift, the resonant Omega counterpart, the Order's ancient betrayal, their crusade to suppress this combined power. Overwhelming, terrifying, exhilarating. "We are," he gasped, staring at Elara, whose eyes now blazed with an echo of his own silver-shadowed light. "We are part of the same shadow." "This is what they feared," Elara whispered, her voice no longer just fearful, but filled with dawning, awesome understanding. "This, resonance, this is what they tried to break." So, a voice, cold as a tomb, echoed from a crumbling archway. The echoes finally awaken. "A pity you will not live to see them sing their full song." From the deepest shadows stepped a figure cloaked in darkness, radiating immense, corrupted power. The Grand Master of the Order of the Silent Fang. Behind them, elite agents fanned out. The trap was sprung. Valerius instinctively shielded Elara, his shadow power roaring with a clarity he'd never known. He felt Elara beside him, no longer cowering, her newly freed magic lashing out in instinctive concert with his. His a storm of silver-edged darkness, hers a river of pure night, their shadows weaving together, an unplanned, breathtakingly powerful shield shimmering around them. The Grand Master paused, a flicker of surprise, then annoyance, in their unseen eyes. "Impressive," the cold voice conceded. "But futile. Your kind was always destined to be broken, or bound." They raised a hand, and a bolt of pure, blighted energy hurtled towards them. He met it with a roar, his shadow surging, Elara's wonderfully reinforcing his, a desperate, defiant stand against ancient hatred. They didn't win, not then, but for a glorious, terrifying moment, as their shadows danced their first true duet, they held the darkness at bay. The battle for their souls had just begun.
The fragile shield of their combined shadows, a breathtaking dance of silver and night, shattered like brittle glass under the Grand Master's renewed, contemptuous assault. A wave of pure, blighted energy, colder and more malevolent than anything Elara had ever imagined, slammed into them, and the ancient ruins, already groaning under the strain of so much unleashed power, finally gave way. With a deafening roar that seemed to tear the very sky asunder, stone and shadow and centuries of dust rained down upon them. Elara screamed, a raw, terrified sound swallowed by the cataclysm as the world dissolved into a suffocating, choking darkness. The last thing she saw Valerius's powerful form lunging to cover her, a living shield against the crushing weight of their collapsing tomb. Was this it? Was this how their fated resonance, so briefly, so beautifully awakened, was meant to end, buried and broken before it ever truly had a chance to sing? Darkness. And silence. A terrifying, absolute silence that pressed in on Elara, heavier even than the tons of rock she knew must be pinning them down. Dust filled her nostrils, her throat, a gritty testament to their entombment. Then, a groan, low and laced with agony, so close it vibrated through the unyielding stone against her cheek. Valerius. "My king," she choked out, her voice a ragged whisper, fear a living serpent quailing in her belly. "Valerius, are you?" He was shielding her, his body a warm, heavy weight above her, but it was an unnatural stillness, a strained rigidity that spoke of terrible injury. I am here, Elara. His voice, when it came, was a mere rasp, tight with pain. Are you unharmed? Unharmed? How could either of them be unharmed when the very air thrummed with the victorious malevolence of the Grand Master, who she could sense, even through layers of stone, was now undoubtedly searching for them, their dark power a palpable, slithering presence just beyond their precarious refuge? I think so, she lied, because what did a few bruises matter when the Alpha King who had claimed her, who had awakened something so profound within her, was clearly in agony because of her, because of them? Her collar, already fractured, felt like a band of ice against her skin, yet beneath it, her own shadows, her own terrified magic, stirred with a desperate, frantic energy. She had to do something. Anything. Looking back, she might have thought, if there had been a back to look to from that suffocating present, it's funny how quickly one learns to embrace the curse one has always feared when the alternative is watching hope die. Focusing past the pain, past the terror, Elara reached out with that nascent, newly understood part of herself, her shadows probing the oppressive darkness, not to fight, not yet, but to feel, to search for a weakness in their stone prison, a way out, or at the very least, a way to breathe. The effort was agonizing, like tearing a part of her own soul away, but then, a small trickle of loose scree shifted above them, and a sliver of blighted air, heavy with the Grand Master's foul magic, whispered into their cramped space. And with it, Elara knew, their brief respite was over, her desperate act, her tiny defiance, had just sounded a dinner bell for the monster hunting them. Ah, there you are, little shadow mice. The Grand Master's voice, amplified by magic, slithered through the newly formed crack, dripping with a cold, reptilian amusement that made Elara's skin crawl. Did you truly think you could hide from me? From your destiny? The sound of shifting stone followed, closer now, the Order's agents clearly working to reach them. Valerius tried to push himself up, a pained grunt escaping him, but Elara felt the tremor of his failing strength. Save your energy, Lion of Vane, the Grand Master purred. Your struggles are pitiable. But your combined resonance? That is a prize worth digging for. And then they were there, the Grand Master looming in the jagged opening their agents had torn, a figure of absolute darkness, their face still obscured by shadows deeper than night, but their intent a palpable wave of terrifying greed. You see, Elara, the chilling voice continued, addressing her directly now, making her feel like an insect under a pin, it was never truly about silencing your little spark. Oh no. It was always about the symphony you could create together. A symphony I intend to conduct. Or, rather, a pause, laden with malevolent promise, to absorb. They spoke of a ritual, of siphoning their intertwined shadow magic, their very life essences, into themselves, of becoming a god through their stolen power. And as if to twist the knife further, the Grand Master revealed the full extent of Elder Maeve's betrayal back at Valerius's court, how the trusted advisor had fed them information, guided their path, all for a sliver of the power the Grand Master promised. She believed she could control a shadow, the figure chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Fool. Only I understand true mastery. They gestured towards Valerius, his breathing shallow, his eyes closed in pain. Your king, your fated mate, he is merely the vessel for the alpha spark. His ancestors, the so-called shadow-gifted Vanes, were all flawed, sentimental fools who either feared their power or were consumed by it. He is no different. But you, shadowed dove. The Grand Master's unseen gaze seemed to burn into her. Your Omega essence, so malleable, so potent once unbound, you have a choice. Join me. Let me perfect your gift. Help me usher in a new age where shadows reign supreme. Or, their voice dropped to a venomous whisper, watch him die, his essence ripped from him, before I take yours anyway. What would you choose, little bird, when faced with such an inevitable, delicious despair? Elara looked at Valerius, his strong face now pale and etched with pain, his magnificent power diminished, yet still a tangible presence beside her, a warmth against the encroaching cold of the Grand Master's intent. Join them? Become a monster like them, wielding her shadows for destruction and dominance? The very thought was a betrayal of the fragile hope that had begun to bloom in her heart, the hope that her magic, their resonance, could be something more than a curse. Something beautiful. Something powerful in its own right, not just a tool for others. How could I not see, she thought, a wave of bitter understanding washing over her, that true evil doesn't just want to destroy you, it wants to convert you, to make you a mirror of its own ugliness? She remembered Valerius's shared vulnerability, his fear of his own king's shadow, his hesitant touch that had felt like the first ray of dawn after an endless night. And in that moment, something within her, something harder and brighter than fear, solidified. She would not break. She would not yield. She feigned a moment of consideration, her gaze downcast, letting the Grand Master savor their anticipated triumph. Then, slowly, she lifted her head, her eyes meeting that shadowy void where a face should be. I choose, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, a quiet defiance that seemed to shock even herself, neither. And with a guttural scream that was part terror, part rage, and all desperate, feral resolve, Elara unleashed every last shred of her shadow magic, not at the Grand Master, not at their agents, but at the intricate, pulsating ritual implements they had begun to array around them, the conduits meant to steal their souls. I am no one's tool, she cried, the words ripped from her very core, as her collar, already fractured, finally, explosively, shattered into 1,000 glittering shards, a rain of broken bondage. Her full Omega shadow essence, vast, wild, and terrifyingly beautiful, erupted from her, a swirling nebula of midnight and starlight, raw and untamed. It didn't just push, it annihilated the ritual stones, turning them to dust. Valerius, jolted by the surge of her power, his eyes flying open, stared at her, not with fear, but with a look of such profound, almost painful awe, it stole her breath. In that moment, his voice, she imagined, would one day reflect, a deep rumble of love and wonder. Her curse was the most magnificent, the most courageous, the most beautiful thing I had ever, or would ever, witness. The Grand Master, their amusement instantly vaporizing into pure, unadulterated rage, let out a sound that was less human and more the shriek of a violated deity. Insolent whelp, they howled, their shadowy forms seeming to expand, to blacken, to become a vortex of pure, negative energy. You will pay for that defiance with an eternity of torment. An overwhelming force, a battering ram of corrupted shadow and blighted will, slammed into Elara. It felt as if her very soul was being torn apart, the light of her newfound freedom, her full power, flickering, dimming under the relentless assault. She heard Valerius roar her name, a sound of pure agony and desperate fury, but she was falling, tumbling into an abyss of pain and encroaching darkness, her beautiful, wild shadows faltering, retreating. She hit the cold stone floor, the last of her strength, her consciousness, seeping away like water through desperate fingers. Vaguely, as if from a great distance, she felt the earth itself tremble, felt the explosive, uncontrolled detonation of Valerius's king's shadow, a cataclysmic wave of grief-fueled, desperate power that cracked the very foundations of the ruins, a sound of utter despair given form. Then, nothing but a profound, consuming silence. When Elara's eyelids fluttered open, how much later she couldn't say, it was to a scene of utter devastation. Valerius lay a short distance away, prone, his magnificent power extinguished, leaving him looking broken, vulnerable. And the Grand Master, though clearly battered by his uncontrolled outburst, was advancing, a triumphant, predatory stillness in their movements, towards her, then towards him, their shadowy hand outstretched, ready to claim their shattered prizes. All seemed lost. The fight was over. They had failed. As the Grand Master's chilling touch neared Elara's heart, a single, almost imperceptible pulse of shadow, a faint, desperate echo of their shared resonance, passed between her and the fallen king, a silent, unseen thread in the overwhelming darkness. A single tear, hot and defiant, traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Was this truly how their song ended, before it had even properly begun?
Darkness, a cold, suffocating blanket, and pain, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of his bones, a testament to the king's shadow he'd unleashed in uncontrolled, grief-stricken fury. Valerius lay broken amidst the ruins, the acrid scent of blighted magic and his own despair filling his senses. He'd failed. Elara, God's Elara. He'd seen her fall, her light extinguished by that monstrous Grand Master. The thought was a fresh wave of agony, sharper than any physical wound. He was dimly aware of the Grand Master's triumphant presence, the sickening thrum of the siphoning ritual beginning, a prelude to an oblivion he almost welcomed if it meant an end to this torment. And then, just as his spirit teetered on the brink of surrender, he felt it, a flicker, so faint it was almost imagined, a silken thread of warmth brushing against the icy void within him. A whisper of shadow, not the Grand Master's corrupted power, but hers. Elara's. It was impossible. She was gone. Yet, the sensation persisted, a tiny, insistent pulse, an echo of her soul calling to his across the desolation. Hope. No, that was too grand a word for such a fragile thing. But it was a reason to fight the encroaching darkness, to claw his way back from the abyss, if only to meet her echo one last time. That faintest spark, that whisper of Elara's essence, became an anchor. Valerius clung to it, drawing on a reserve of what he hadn't known he possessed. He forced his eyes open, the blighted ruins swimming into focus. He saw the Grand Master, a vortex of stolen shadows, hands outstretched over Elara's still form, the siphoning ritual in full, terrifying swing. Dark tendrils of energy snaked towards him. But as they neared Elara, Valerius saw them sputter, falter, as if meeting an unseen, unexpected resistance. Her spirit, he realized with a jolt that was part awe, part fierce, protective love, was fighting even in unconsciousness, her core refusing to yield. And that internal defiance, that silent call he'd felt, it now resonated through him, stoking the dying embers of his own king's shadow, not into wild fury this time, but into a cold, focused point of incandescent rage and unshakable resolve. She is not yours to take. A voice, his own yet deeper, imbued with the ancient power of his lineage, seemed to thunder in the confines of his mind, a vow to the universe itself. His fingers twitched, then clenched. Slowly, agonizingly, fueled by that resonant spark and the sight of Elara's indomitable spirit, Valerius began to push himself up from the cold, unforgiving stone. The Grand Master, sensing the shift, the unexpected surge of power from their supposedly broken captive, turned, their shadowy visage radiating surprise, then a renewed, almost gleeful, malice. Still fighting, little lion? The cold voice sneered. Impressive, but your roar is but a whimper now. Is it? Valerius managed, his voice a raw rasp, as he finally gained his feet, swaying but upright. His gaze locked with Elara's, whose eyes fluttered open at that very moment, no longer dull with despair, but blazing with a fierce, reciprocal light, her own shadows swirling around her, no longer just wild, but seeking his, yearning to harmonize. In that shared gaze, a universe of understanding passed between them. Their shared lineage, their fated resonance, the unbearable pain, and the unyielding, defiant love that now bound them stronger than any chain, stronger than any curse. Our shadow, Elara's voice, though weak, reached him, clear as a silver bell in the oppressive silence, perhaps spoken aloud, perhaps only in their minds, he couldn't be sure. It's not a curse, Valerius. He met her gaze, a slow, feral smile. his first true smile in what felt like a lifetime, touching his lips. "No, my heart," he answered, the endearment slipping out as naturally as breathing, as essential. "It's us." And as if summoned by that shared acknowledgement, their individual shadows, his a storm of silver-edged darkness, hers a river of pure, fluid night, surged, then merged, intertwining around them, creating a new, stable, and terrifyingly potent combined aura that hummed with an ancient, resonant power. The air crackled, the ground trembled, not from destruction, but from creation. They were whole, they were one, and they were ready. What fool, Valerius thought, a surge of pure, unadulterated alpha power coursing through him, invigorating him, healing him, believed they could ever truly sever a bond woven from the very fabric of existence itself. The Grand Master actually took a step back, a flicker of something akin to fear, or perhaps just shocked disbelief, in their dark aura. "Impossible!" the Grand Master shrieked, their voice cracking, losing its cold composure for the first time. "The resonance should have consumed you both, made you puppets." They attacked then, with the full, desperate force of their corrupted, stolen power, a maelstrom of blighted energy and shrieking shadows aimed at annihilating this unforeseen, terrifying union. But Elara and Valerius moved as one, a perfectly synchronized duet of shadow and light, their movements fluid, intuitive, needing no words, no conscious thought. His alpha shadow, now tempered by her presence, no longer just a destructive force, formed immense protective barriers, absorbed the blighted attacks, and unleashed powerful, concussive strikes. And her omega shadow, no longer timid or suppressed, but bold and incredibly agile, wove through his, around his, a river of finesse and control, deflecting, redirecting, finding weaknesses in the Grand Master's onslaught, and with a touch that felt like starlight and midnight combined, subtly mending their defenses, soothing the sting of near misses. It was a breathtaking, deadly dance, a symphony of controlled darkness that pushed back against the blight's chaotic malevolence. Valerius had never felt so powerful, so complete. Every move anticipated, every surge of his power amplified and guided by her presence, her magic a cool, steadying counterpoint to his fiery intensity. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a victim, not as a curse, but as his magnificent, resilient queen, her eyes blazing with a warrior's spirit, her shadows her birthright, finally unleashed. There was a moment, a critical, terrible moment, when the Grand Master tried to turn Valerius's own shadow power back on him, to ignite the old Vane Fury into a self-destructive inferno. He felt the familiar, terrifying heat begin to build, the rage clawing for release. But then, Elara's magic, cool and infinitely gentle yet unbreakably strong, surrounded his, insulated him, absorbed the corrupted feedback, and with a graceful, almost contemptuous flick of her will, sent it spiraling back towards their attacker. Looking back, Valerius would later reflect, his heart swelling with a love so profound it was an ache in his chest. It wasn't about who was stronger, or who landed the final blow. It was about how perfectly, how beautifully, our strengths and vulnerabilities, our light and our shadow, danced together, finally in harmony. With a shared, silent understanding, they focused their combined will, their resonant power, on the pulsating, dark crystal Valerius had seen the Grand Master consult earlier, the one that seemed to be the anchor for their corrupted magic and perhaps their control over the blight. A beam of pure, concentrated resonant shadow, silver and black entwined, shot from their clasped hands, striking the crystal with unerring accuracy. It shattered with a sound like 1,000 tortured souls screaming in release. The Grand Master howled, their form flickering violently, their power visibly, catastrophically, diminishing. In a final, desperate, almost pathetic gambit, the Grand Master, their form now unstable, a dissipating cloud of angry shadow, lunged towards Elara, no longer with a plan of siphoning, but with a raw, spiteful intent to possess, to defile, to destroy the Omega shadow they clearly saw as the more malleable heart of the resonance. "If I cannot have your power," the fading voice shrieked, "I will silence your song forever." But Valerius was ready. Elara was ready. With a roar that was both king and mate, an affirmation of their bond, their love, their undeniable destiny, he unleashed a perfectly controlled, perfectly harmonized wave of their combined resonant shadow. It wasn't a blast of chaotic fury, but a precise, cleansing tide that washed over the Grand Master, purging their influence, unraveling their corrupted essence, until with a final, despairing shriek that echoed through the collapsing ruins, they simply dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the scent of ozone and ancient, bitter dust. Silence descended once more, but this time, it was not oppressive. It was a silence of exhaustion, of victory, of profound, almost sacred relief. The immediate area around them, where the blight had been thickest, began to subtly change, the oppressive darkness receding, the twisted stones seeming to sigh as a faint, almost imperceptible natural light filtered through the cracks in the ruined ceiling above. Valerius turned to Elara, his strength waning now that the immediate threat was gone, his body screaming in protest, but his heart was soaring. She swayed, her own energy depleted, and he caught her, their bodies collapsing together onto the cold, blessed earth, a tangle of shared exhaustion, shared relief, and a love that had literally conquered death and shadow. He held her close, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her true scent, wild honey, night-blooming jasmine, and the clean, sharp tang of her unique shadow magic, no longer masked, no longer a source of fear, but a perfume that spoke of home, of belonging. "You saved me," Elara whispered against his chest, her voice thick with tears and wonder. Valerius tightened his embrace, his own eyes burning. "No, Elara," he corrected, his voice rough with an emotion too profound for mere words. "We saved each other." He gently touched the place where her collar had been, then cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her soft skin. "The unspoken things. I love you. I was lost without you. I accept all of you, every shadow, every light," hung powerfully in the air between them, communicated through their gaze, through the frantic, steadying beat of their hearts pressed so closely together. As the first true rays of a reclaimed dawn began to pierce the gloom of the ruins, casting a hesitant, golden light upon their battered forms, Valerius looked at Elara, his shadowed dove, his resonant heart, his queen, and a new understanding, a profound and unwavering love, settled in his soul. "Our path ahead," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet strength that came not just from his crown, but from the woman in his arms, "will be fraught with challenges, my love. They will fear us, perhaps even hunt us still, those who do not understand. But we face it together." Elara met his gaze, her own fear finally, blessedly, replaced by a quiet, unshakable strength, a radiant light that seemed to emanate from her very core. "Together," she agreed, her voice clear and true, a promise that sealed their future, a future forged in the heart of their shared storm.
The golden light of the reclaimed dawn, so hesitant at first, now streamed through the shattered roof of the ancient ruins, bathing them in a warmth that felt like a benediction. Valerius held Elara close, his strong arms a haven against the lingering chill of their ordeal, his heartbeat a steady, reassuring rhythm against her ear. Together, he had vowed, and the word resonated in her soul, a promise of a future she'd never dared to dream of. Yet, as the first wave of exhaustion receded, a new, almost dizzying awareness settled in. The Grand Master was gone, their immediate threat vanquished, but what came next? How did a former, collared Omega, a creature of shadows and fear, step out into the light as, what? The king's mate? Something more? The thought was a terrifying, exhilarating precipice. And then, as if summoned by her unasked question, the sound of approaching footsteps, cautious but determined, reached them, Valerius's loyal guards, Kale and Tarvin at their head, their faces a mixture of profound relief and utter, stunned awe as they took in the sight of their king, battered but alive, and the woman cradled in his arms, no longer a mere servant, but someone radiating an entirely new, quietly formidable power. The world, Elara knew with a sudden, breathtaking certainty, had irrevocably changed, not just for her, but for all of them. Their journey back to the capital was different. Valerius, despite his own weariness, insisted Elara ride beside him, not on a gentle mare this time, but on a spirited warhorse from his own stables that, to everyone's astonishment, accepted her with a gentle nuzzle. The remnants of her collar were gone, left behind in the dust of the ruins, and with its absence, Elara felt a lightness, a freedom that was almost painful in its intensity. Her shadows, her magic, were still there, a quiet hum beneath her skin, no longer a source of terror but a nascent strength, a part of her that Valerius's unwavering acceptance had begun to heal. She noticed the way the soldiers looked at her now, no longer with pity or suspicion, but with a dawning respect, a hesitant curiosity. They had seen her fight, seen their king fight for her, with her. "You carry yourself differently, Elara," Valerius murmured one evening as they made camp, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers of warmth down her spine. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the bare skin of her throat where the collar had once been. "There is light in your shadows now." She leaned into his touch, a small, unconscious gesture of trust that made his eyes soften with an emotion so profound it stole her breath. "Perhaps," she whispered, her gaze meeting his, full of a love that still felt too new, too vast to comprehend, "it is because your light found them, my king." The return to the capital was met with a stunned, echoing silence. The court, assembled to welcome their victorious king, stared as Elara entered the throne room by his side, not trailing behind him, but as an equal. The whisper started then, of course, a shocked susurrus that rippled through the assembled nobles. But Valerius's hand, warm and strong in hers, was an anchor. Elder Maeve, her betrayal now common knowledge thanks to the swift justice of Valerius's returning scouts, was brought before them in chains, her face a mask of bitter resentment. Elara looked at the woman who had so subtly fueled the kingdom's fear, who had sought to use her as a pawn. There was no triumph in Elara's heart, only a weary sadness. "You feared what you did not understand, Elder Maeve," Elara said, her voice clear and steady, carrying through the suddenly silent hall. Valerius gave a small nod, ceding the judgment to her. "You sought to control power through deceit, but true strength, I am learning, comes from acceptance, from balance." She paused, then delivered her verdict, one that stunned the court with its unexpected mercy. "You will be exiled to the Silent Isles, to reflect on the shadows you embraced. Perhaps there, you will find your own light." As Maeve was led away, a new kind of murmur went through the court, not of fear, but of hesitant respect for the quiet strength of their king's chosen. Before the day was out, another surprise arrived, a delegation from the formidable Northern Ice Pack, their alpha a stern, silver-haired woman whose eyes missed nothing. "We heard tell of a king and his omega who command the very shadows, who healed a swathe of the blight with their passing," the alpha stated, her voice like cracking ice. "Prophecy spoke of such a resonance. We have come to see if the world has truly changed, or if this is merely another vain king with a powerful, temporary ward." Valerius's hand tightened on Elara's. "The world has changed, Alpha Volkov," he said, his voice resonating with quiet power. "And this is my queen." What followed were months of healing, not just for the land, but for hearts and minds. Elara and Valerius, working in tandem, traveled to the remaining blighted territories. It was a slow, arduous process. She found that her shadow magic, when combined with his, could indeed coax life back into the poisoned earth, not with force, but with a gentle, persuasive weaving of energies. His power was the deep river, hers the intricate currents that guided its flow. They learned from each other, Valerius teaching her of statecraft, of the burdens and responsibilities of leadership, and she, in turn, showing him the quieter strengths of compassion, of listening, of finding balance not just in magic, but in governance. The people of the recovered lands began to look at them not with fear, but with a gratitude that warmed Elara to her soul. Children would bring her wildflowers, their parents offering humble thanks. The raven, that ancient shifter spirit Valerius now called Nyx, became a constant, watchful companion, sometimes perched on his shoulder, sometimes on hers, a silent, feathered symbol of their intertwined destiny. "It seems, my love," Valerius said one evening, as they watched a village celebrate its first blight-free harvest in years, his arm around her waist, "that our curse is becoming their blessing." Elara leaned her head on his shoulder, a profound sense of peace settling within her. "Perhaps all shadows need is a little light to find their purpose, Valerius. Even a king's." He chuckled, a warm, rich sound that she loved. "And an Omega's wisdom to guide it. The easy affection." Between them, the shared smiles, the comfortable silences, it was a language all its own, a testament to the deep, abiding love that had grown from a terrifying claim into a partnership that was reshaping their world. Yet, the remnants of the Order of the Silent Fang, though scattered, were not entirely vanquished. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Elara and Valerius oversaw the rebuilding of a northern village, a desperate, fanatical band of them launched a surprise attack, their faces contorted with a hateful zeal, their weapons aimed at the heart of what they still considered an abomination. But this time, Elara felt no terror, only a cold, clear resolve. She and Valerius moved as one, their shadows leaping to meet the threat, a perfectly synchronized dance of power and protection. His strikes were devastating, hers precise, deflecting, binding, shielding the innocent. It was over quickly, the attackers subdued, their dark purpose extinguished. Standing amidst the grateful, awestruck villagers, Valerius took Elara's hand. He unclasped the heavy Vane royal signet from his own finger and, before the assembled crowd, gently slid it onto hers, beside the simple silver band he had gifted her weeks before. "My people," his voice rang out, clear and strong, imbued with all the authority of his Alpha King blood, yet softened with an undeniable love as his gaze rested on Elara. "For too long, the Vane kings have wrestled with their shadows alone. But no more. Behold Elara, my mate, my heart, my resonant soul. She is not just my Luna, she is your queen, my equal in all things, a beacon against any darkness that dares threaten our lands." A stunned silence, then a hesitant cheer, which quickly swelled into a roar of approval. He then drew her close, whispering for her ears only, "My power was once my deepest shadow, the thing I feared most within myself." His eyes, those beautiful blue glaciers, now held only warmth for her. "But with you, Elara, my magnificent shadowed dove, it has found its light, its purpose, its heart." Amongst the belongings of the defeated Order agents, Kale later found a tattered, ancient map, its edges charred, detailing routes to distant, forgotten lands, marked with symbols similar to the one from Elara's collar, hinting at other aberrations, other souls the Order had sought to silence or control across the world. Their work, it seemed, was far from over. But looking at Valerius, at the hope in his eyes, Elara knew they would face it, as they had faced everything else, together. Months later, peace had truly settled over the western mountains, a deep, abiding tranquility that Elara had once believed impossible. The kingdom was healing, vibrant green chasing away the last vestiges of the blight, laughter echoing in villages that had once known only despair. She stood with Valerius on the highest balcony of the Onyx Citadel, the sprawling capital city glittering below them like a carpet of fallen stars under the gentle gaze of a full, silver moon. Her head rested comfortably on his strong shoulder, his arm a warm, secure weight around her waist. Nyx, their raven familiar, preened contentedly on the stone balustrade nearby, a silent guardian of their shared peace. There was no collar around her neck now, only the cool kiss of the night air and the comforting weight of Valerius's signet ring on her finger, a symbol not of ownership, but of an unbreakable, joyous partnership. Their shadows, once a source of fear and isolation, now danced playfully around their feet, sometimes separate, sometimes merging into one harmonious whole, a reflection of the two souls they belonged to. Looking back, "Elara, my queen," Valerius whispered, his voice a soft rumble against her hair, a voice that now held only love and a deep, abiding contentment. Every single moment of darkness, every trial, every fear, it was all worth it, 1,000 times over, to find this light, this peace, with you. Elara turned in his embrace, her heart swelling with an emotion so vast, so profound, it felt as if it might lift her from the very stones. Her eyes, no longer haunted but shining with the clear, steady light of love and acceptance, met his. "Our shadows dance well together, don't they, my king?" she murmured, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. He smiled, that rare, breathtaking smile that was hers alone, and leaned down to capture her lips in a kiss that was both a promise and a prayer, a culmination of all they had endured and all the bright dawns yet to come. It was a kiss that tasted of forever, of shadows embraced, of a love forged in the heart of a storm, now a beacon for their entire world. And as their entwined hands rested on the balcony rail, her ring beside his, it was clear that their happily ever after was not just an ending, but a magnificent, resonant beginning.